One of the most interesting parts of Genshin Impact's combat system is elemental reactions. Doing combos with your characters is just so satisfying that it can make you feel like a true elemental maestro, orchestrating the perfect symphony of destruction and leaving your enemies crushed. In this video, we'll explore each elemental reaction's intricacies, damage calculations, and the strategic depth of combining different elements to improve your gameplay. This guide is a beginner to advanced type video, so you might pick up a thing or two even if you've been playing the game for a while. Let's start with defining what elemental reaction is. Elemental reactions occur when specific combinations of elements are applied to targets. The targets can either be monsters, player characters, or even objects. These reactions cause various effects, such as damage bonuses, negative buffs, AoE damage, or damage over time. With 16 distinct types of elemental reactions currently available in the game, each one presents its own advantages, disadvantages, and unique nuances when affecting opponents. Let's go over the basics of how to trigger elemental reactions. To trigger elemental reactions, you need to apply specific elements to a target and then trigger them with a different element. Step 1. Apply an element using your character's elemental skill or burst. The element you choose determines the type of elemental reaction you can trigger. For instance, applying Pyro opens up possibilities for reactions like Vaporize, Overloaded, Melt, Swirl, Crystallize, or Burgeon. Remember, some skills can convert your regular attacks into certain elements. Take Chongyun's elemental skill, for example, which converts any normal attack into cryo as long as you're within its AoE. With this effect, even your regular attacks, charged attacks, and plunging attacks can apply or trigger an elemental reaction. Step 2. Trigger the reaction by using an attack with a different element from the one you already applied. If you initially used Pyro, consider using Hydro, Cryo, or any element other than Pyro for the triggering element. Elemental status, also known as elemental aura, manifests as an icon above your enemy's head when you use any elemental attack. These icons represent the elemental status applied to the enemy and are consumed upon triggering an elemental reaction. For instance, if you land a Pyro elemental attack on an enemy, you will see the Pyro icon displayed above their head. This indicates that the enemy is now susceptible to Pyro-related elemental reactions like Overloaded, Vaporize, or Melt. Upon successfully triggering an elemental reaction, the icons above the enemy's head will vanish. Well, most of the time. We'll talk more about that in more detail as we progress through this video. Anyway, elemental reactions such as Melt will no longer trigger once the icon disappears, unless you reapply another elemental status. It's important to note that elemental aura does not stack, and using a skill with the same element to enemies with an existing elemental status only refreshes its duration. Elemental reaction damage is calculated based on the character who triggered the reaction and not the one who applied the initial element. For instance, when using Fischl's elemental skill on a monster and triggering it with D-Luke, the damage from the resulting overloaded reaction will be calculated based on D-Luke's stat. This holds true regardless of whether the character is currently active on the field or not, as well as for any type of elemental reaction that was triggered. Now that we've covered the basics of elemental reactions, it's time to delve into the mechanics of each reaction. We'll explore an advanced concept called internal cooldowns later in the video. But before that, let's ensure we have a solid grasp of the mechanics of each elemental reaction. Elemental reactions can be grouped into 3 main categories. They are Multiplicative Reactions, Transformative Reactions, and Additive Reactions. These categories provide insights into how damage is calculated and the unique mechanics that influence their effects on monsters and the environment. Let's start with multiplicative type of elemental reactions. Multiplicative elemental reactions significantly amplify the damage output of the character who triggers it. These reactions are influenced by the character's overall stats and the sequence of elemental status applications. When triggering elemental reactions under this category, several stats come into play. The character's level, elemental mastery, attack stat, damage percentage stat, critical damage stat, and talent level. The damage calculation for multiplicative reactions is straightforward. It multiplies the final damage calculation inflicted by the character by either 1.5x or 2x, which is further amplified based on the elemental mastery stat of the character. You can check your character status detail for the exact multiplier of your elemental mastery stats. Fair warning though, elemental mastery is great for support characters, but not for your main DPS. Well, generally speaking. Multiplicative reactions are also sequence specific, meaning the damage multiplier can vary depending on the order in which the elements are applied. Let's take a look at the elemental reactions that fall under this category. Melt occurs when you hit cryo with a pyro element or vice versa. It amplifies the elemental attack damage of the character who triggers it based on the sequence of elemental status application. Applying a cryo skill on a monster with a pyro status will multiply your damage by 1.5 times. Inversely, applying a pyro skill on a monster with a cryo status will multiply your attack by 2x. And as mentioned earlier, multiplicative elemental reactions take into account the character's overall stat. And if the critical rate triggers during activation, it will also be multiplied. This damage will also be enhanced further based on the elemental mastery stat. While a 2x damage multiplier is impressive, using the 1.5x multiplier may result in higher DPS during long fights. This concept is known as forward and reverse reactions, which we'll discuss shortly. Vaporize occurs when you hit hydro with pyro, or vice versa. Like melt, it amplifies your elemental attack damage based on the order of which the element are applied. Applying a pyro skill on a monster with a hydro status will multiply your pyro damage by 1.5x. On the other hand, if you apply hydro to pyro, you get twice as much damage. Vaporize shares the same damage calculation and behavior as melt, critical rate, and all. The forward and reverse reactions concept applies to all multiplicative type of elemental reactions, namely Vaporize and Melt. Forward reactions refer to the stronger multipliers of Vaporize and Melt, the 2x, while reverse reactions refer to the weaker ones, the 1.5x. While forward reactions look better for your damage, both have their pros and cons. Forward reactions result in higher damage output in a single hit, but most of the time, you can trigger the forward reaction only once for each elemental status application. On the other hand, reverse reactions preserve some of the elemental status from your enemies, allowing you to trigger the elemental reaction multiple times at the expense of lower damage in a single instance. What this basically means is that during long fights, reverse reactions such as reverse vaporize or reverse melt will outperform forward reactions due to the higher frequency of activation. This concept is closely related to internal cooldowns and the elemental gauge theory. Transformative reactions add an elemental reaction damage separate from the skill's damage. When it comes to damage calculation, transformative reactions rely on the character's level and elemental mastery only. While they do not have the potential for critical hits, they often boast higher damage scaling based on character's level and elemental mastery compared to other categories. It's important to note that transformative reactions ignore the monster's defense, but are still influenced by their elemental resistance. Let's dive into the specific elemental reactions within this category. The overloaded elemental reaction triggers when you hit Electro with Pyro, or vice versa. It creates an additional AoE pyro damage on top of the elemental damage you inflicted. Overload has a 2x multiplier that ignores the target's defense and level, but monsters infused with pyro elements are immune to its damage. Furthermore, Overloaded has the added benefit of knocking back smaller enemies, such as slimes or helicurls, providing crowd control. However, the knockback effect could be detrimental for melee characters, as it can create distance between them and their targets. Electro-Charged occurs when you hit Hydro with an Electro element or vice versa. When enemies are affected by this reaction, they will continuously receive Electro damage until the elemental status wears off. This damage occurs at a 1-second interval and can temporarily stun enemies. Electro-Charged carries a 1.2x damage multiplier and will also spread as a chain lightning effect to any nearby enemy with a Hydro status. But note that the chain lightning effect does not apply elemental status to the enemies it hits. Furthermore, each enemy can only take one instance of Electro-Charged damage every 0.5 seconds. This means that if you rapidly reapply the reaction, some enemies may not take Electro-Charged damage if they were recently affected. What's unique about this reaction is that both Electro and Hydro status can coexist simultaneously during its duration. This allows you to introduce a third element to trigger a different elemental reaction even when Electro-Charged is active. Hey, if you're getting some value from this video so far, please leave us a like. I appreciate it so much. Superconduct occurs when you hit Cryo with an Electro element or vice versa. It creates an additional physical AoE damage from the epicenter of the superconductor on top of the character's elemental damage. It also ignores the target's defense and level, and all enemies hit by its AoE will get a 40% physical resistance reduction debuff for 12 seconds. As a transformative elemental reaction, the damage of Superconduct can be scaled by leveling your character or increasing elemental mastery. However, the debuff's effect will remain unchanged regardless of the caster's level or elemental mastery. Also, the debuff can decrease the enemy's physical resistance to a negative number, but its effectiveness is halved once the physical resistance threshold goes below 0. For example, triggering Superconduct to a monster with a 20% physical resistance will reduce its physical resistance to 10%. The frozen elemental reaction occurs when you hit Hydro with a Cryo element, or vice versa. It freezes the enemies in a small AoE, rendering them immobile. The duration of the freeze does not increase with levels or elemental mastery. And while it does not apply additional damage, it serves as an excellent crowd control effect, especially when dealing with multiple enemies. During the frozen state, enemies retain the Cryo elemental status, making them susceptible to other cryo-related reactions such as Melt, Superconduct, Swirl, or Crystallize. Additionally, the frozen status opens up the possibility to activate the Shatter elemental reaction, which can only be triggered on enemies under the frozen state. However, it's important to note that the frozen status does not prevent boss monsters from moving. Shatter is a unique elemental reaction that can only be triggered on enemies affected by the frozen status. When you strike a frozen enemy using claymores, geoskills, or other forms of heavy attacks, it will add a shattered damage, adding a 1.5x physical damage multiplier on top of your regular attack. Notably, shatter damage is not dependent on your physical attack stat, but rather relies on your character's level and elemental mastery stat. It deals consistent damage regardless of the enemy's defense or level. Similar to other elemental reactions, Shatter removes the elemental status from the enemies once triggered. However, it can sometimes trigger multiple times and even activate other elemental reactions simultaneously when using elemental attacks from Claymore users. This effect is related to the elemental gauge theory, but it's a bit hard to track and even harder to pull off consistently. Lastly, it does not trigger weapon or artifact effects, or character passives except for the Tri-Karma purification from Nahida's elemental skill. Swirl occurs when you hit an enemy with either a Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro-elemental status with a Nemo elemental attack. It adds Swirl damage on top of your current elemental damage. Swirl ignores the target's level and defense, and has a damage multiplier of 0.6x. This damage is affected by the caster's level and elemental mastery only. Although this damage seems low, Swirl functions a little differently from the other elemental reactions. Swirl takes any existing element it comes in contact with and spreads it as damage within an AoE. In addition to the Swirl damage, it will also deal elemental damage of the same element it absorbed, potentially triggering other forms of elemental reactions. It's important to note that a Nemo element itself cannot apply an elemental status to enemies, so there must be an existing elemental status before you can trigger it. Swirl works best with characters equipped with Viridescent Venerer, which reduces elemental resistance of the elements it absorbs. The Crystallize reaction triggers when either Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro elements come in contact with the Geo element. When you trigger this reaction, monsters will drop an elemental crystal that matches their current elemental status. The crystals will spawn in front of the enemy whenever possible. And upon obtaining the crystal, it creates an elemental shield that absorbs all incoming damage. The shield can absorb significantly more damage from attacks of the same element, such as a pyro attack against a pyro shield. Its durability is based on your character's elemental mastery and level. Picking up multiple shards refreshes the shield's duration and its element type, but the reaction can only trigger once every 1 second for every target. This trigger cooldown applies to all Geo characters, even if you can switch characters fast enough. Like a Nemo element, Geo attacks cannot apply an elemental status without an existing one. To maximize the effectiveness of the Crystallize reaction, consider enabling the Geo-Elemental Resonance or pairing it with the archaic Petra artifact. The burning elemental reaction triggers when you apply Pyro to Dendro or vice versa. Like Electro-Charged, burning applies Pyro damage over time until the elemental status disappears. It has a damage multiplier of 0.25x per second, takes every 0.25 seconds, and usually doesn't last very long. So compared to Electro-Charged, burning is a little more bursty. But honestly, its damage and duration is a little lackluster compared to other reactions. However, while the burning state is active, you can cast different elements to trigger other pyro-related reactions, expanding your options for elemental synergy. Additionally, burning is closely tied to various object-specific elemental reactions. Objects such as grass or shields from some helicurls are considered dendro elements. So you can set off the burning elemental reaction on those objects, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And if you play long enough, you will also encounter some helicurl mages that can cast a wall of vines in the surrounding area. Those too can be removed using pyro attack. Bloom triggers when you apply hydro to a dendro element or vice versa. Unlike other reactions, Bloom itself does not initially cause damage to monsters. Instead, it creates dendro cores that you can utilize to trigger Hyperbloom or Burgeon. Dendro cores automatically explode after 6 seconds, dealing an AoE dendro damage within a 5m radius. It also has a threshold limit of 5, and if you exceed this, the oldest core will explode. Bloom's AoE damage has a 2x damage multiplier, and it can also damage the players. However, it only applies 5% of the damage that it would have inflicted on the enemies. Hyperbloom occurs when you apply the electro element to a dendro core generated by the Bloom elemental reaction. When Hyperbloom occurs, it clears the dendro core it comes in contact with and creates a homing missile that deals dendro damage to its target. The homing missile carries a 3x damage multiplier, which is currently the highest in the game, and has a very small AoE upon landing. Just like Bloom, it can damage the players for 5% of the damage it would have inflicted on monsters. The Burgeon elemental reaction triggers when you apply the pyro element to a dendro core generated by Bloom. Similar to Hyperbloom, Burgeon clears the dendro core from the field and deals dendro damage upon activation. Burgeon also has a 3x damage multiplier and has an AoE radius of 5m, similar to Bloom. And just like Bloom and Hyperbloom, players can also take 5% of the damage if they are within the AoE range of the reaction. Additive elemental reactions provide a flat damage bonus to the character triggering the reaction. It's somewhat similar to the multiplicative type of reactions, in the sense that the triggering character's attack, critical damage, and damage percentage bonus all contribute to the final damage calculation. However, instead of amplifying it, it simply adds a flat damage bonus. So, while you'll see a higher damage when scoring critical hits, the bonus damage you gained from this elemental reaction didn't actually increase. The flat damage bonus scales primarily with character level and elemental mastery, but certain artifacts and talents can further enhance it. Here's a bonus tip. When considering builds that plays well with additive reactions, it's important to note that increasing elemental mastery might not be very beneficial for your main DPS. Instead, consider using artifacts such as the Thundering Fury set, which can significantly boost the reaction damage without sacrificing attack and damage stats. Lastly, specific skills like Baisu's 4th Ascension passive talent can further increase the base damage of additive reactions. Let's explore the elemental reactions that fall under this category, shall we? Quicken occurs when you hit Dendro with Electro or vice versa. This elemental reaction does not cause any damage, but it's an important catalyst that allows you to trigger the Aggravate or Spread elemental reactions. Its duration lasts for about 9 to 13 seconds and can be refreshed by reapplying Dendro or Electro before expiration. The Quicken reaction can coexist with the Electro and Dendro elements, enabling you to trigger Aggravate or Spread with Quicken simultaneously. Furthermore, the Quicken state acts as a Dendro aura, allowing you to trigger other elemental reactions besides Aggravate and Spread during its duration. Spread occurs when you hit a monster affected by the Quicken elemental reaction with the Dendro element. So you need to apply Dendro plus Electro first, and then Dendro again to trigger the reaction. It adds a 1.25x flat damage bonus to the character who triggered the reaction. As an additive reaction, the flat damage bonus scales off of elemental mastery and character level, but it also considers the critical damage and damage percentage stat into the final damage calculation, albeit indirectly. Spread can trigger simultaneously with Quicken, allowing for potential infinite looping of the reaction as long as you can consistently apply Electro and Dendro statuses to your opponent. Aggravate is triggered by using the Electro element on enemies affected by the Quicken elemental reaction. So that'll be Electro plus Dendro, and then Electro again. It adds a 1.15x flat damage bonus to the character who triggers the reaction, scaling off of elemental mastery and character level. Like Spread, it can coexist with Quicken, and factors like critical hits and damage percentage stats are taken into account in the final damage calculation. Now that we've covered every elemental reaction, let's go into some more advanced stuff. Think of internal cooldowns like a throttle mechanism designed to prevent overly rapid triggering of elemental reactions. Each type of elemental attack is subject to its own distinct internal cooldown, which usually lasts approximately 2.5 seconds. This means you need to wait for 2.5 seconds before applying another elemental aura to an enemy. If you want to trigger elemental reactions more frequently, it's recommended to use characters with low internal cooldowns or strategically vary your skill usage pattern to take advantage of the separate internal cooldowns of each skill. Some transformative reactions also have their own internal cooldowns of around 0.5 seconds. However, special effects like knockbacks or mini-stuns can still occur during the cooldown period. Here's a quick list of the ICDs of each elemental reaction. If you're interested in learning more, check out our video discussing internal cooldown in more detail. Again, the link will be in the description. For now, just remember that not all elemental attacks apply elemental status to enemies. We hope you found this video helpful. Show us some love by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. See you in the next one!